Distinguished viewers, from January 13th to 17th, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney will travel to Beijing for meetings with President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang. This is Canada's first Prime Ministerial visit to China since 2017. It comes at a moment when the United States has imposed tariffs on Canadian exports, threatened annexation, and treated Canada's economy as leverage in unrelated disputes. To some observers, this timing may seem provocative. To anyone who understands strategy, it is inevitable. This visit is not about choosing between Washington and Beijing. It is about ensuring that Canada never again finds itself with only one option. For decades, Canada's economic security rested on a single assumption: that the United States would remain a stable, predictable, rules-based trading partner. That assumption has collapsed. Trade has become conditional. Tariffs have become political weapons, and economic dependence has revealed itself as vulnerability. Prime Minister Carney's response is not emotional or confrontational. It is structural. He is redesigning Canada's economic relationships so that pressure from any single country, no matter how powerful, loses its effectiveness. This is not retaliation, this is statecraft, and it begins in Beijing. To understand why this China visit matters, we must first understand how Canada arrived at this moment. For most of the post-NAFTA era, Canada's trade policy operated on a simple principle: maintain close alignment with the United States, accept that approximately 75% of exports would go south, and trust that the relationship would remain stable because stability served both nations. For decades, that trust was justified. Trade disputes were resolved through established mechanisms. Disagreements were managed diplomatically. The relationship had friction, but it had structure. That structure began to fracture during Donald Trump's first term and has collapsed entirely during his second. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum were imposed on spurious national security grounds. Agricultural exports faced sudden restrictions unrelated to market conditions. Auto industry investments were threatened, despite decades of integrated supply chains. And throughout, Canada's complaints were met not with negotiation, but with dismissal. The breaking point came when President Trump began openly discussing Canadian annexation, initially framed as jokes, but increasingly accompanied by policy pressure. When the President of the United States suggests that your country should cease to exist as an independent nation, the relationship has moved beyond trade disputes into something more fundamental. Canada had to reassess not just specific policies, but the entire framework of dependence those policies rested upon. This reassessment led to a clear conclusion: Canada's exposure to US economic pressure had become untenable. Not because the United States is an adversary, it is not, but because relying on any single partner for 3/4 of your export market creates vulnerability that can be exploited. The solution is not to abandon the US market. The solution is to ensure it is not the only market that matters. This is where China becomes relevant. Canada-China relations have been frozen since 2019, when diplomatic tensions over the Ming-Wanzhou extradition case caused a complete breakdown in dialogue. Trade suffered. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola devastated prairie farmers. Access to the world's second-largest economy was effectively closed, and Canada absorbed those costs largely to maintain alignment with US policy preferences. But here is the uncomfortable question that now confronts Canadian policymakers. If alignment with the United States brings tariffs anyway, if loyalty earns threats rather than protection, if dependence creates vulnerability rather than security, then what exactly is Canada sacrificing for? The answer to that question is driving this visit to Beijing. Prime Minister Carney has been explicit about his objective. Canada will double its non-US exports within 5 years. This is not rhetoric, it is policy. And China, as the world's second-largest economy and Canada's second-largest single-country trading partner, at $118.7 billion in two-way merchandise trade in 2024, is central to that objective. The visit itself is structured to signal seriousness. This is a full-state visit, not a brief stopover. Prime Minister Carney will meet with both President Xi and Premier Li. He will engage with business leaders in multiple sectors: energy, agriculture, infrastructure, and technology. He will visit multiple cities, and he will do so immediately before attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, ensuring that the message of Canada's economic diversification reaches global business and political leaders simultaneously. The symbolism is deliberate. For 8 years, No Canadian Prime Minister visited China. Now, within months of taking office, Mark Carney is in Beijing. The message to Washington is clear. Canada is no longer waiting for permission to pursue its economic interests. Canada is no longer absorbing pressure quietly. Canada is building alternatives. And those alternatives are real, substantial, and beginning now. Let us examine the specific strategic elements of this China visit and what they reveal about Canada's evolving approach to economic sovereignty. The most immediate and tangible issue on the table is agricultural trade, particularly canola. Canadian canola farmers have been devastated by Chinese tariffs imposed in 2019. These tariffs had nothing to do with product quality or market conditions. They were political retaliation for Canada's role in the Ming-Wanzhou case. Canadian farmers lost access to a market worth billions of dollars annually. Alternative markets could not absorb the volume. Prices collapsed. Farm incomes fell. And throughout this crisis, Canada maintained its position largely because US policy demanded it. If this visit results in restored access for Canadian canola and other agricultural products, the impact on prairie economies will be immediate and substantial. But the significance extends beyond agriculture. It demonstrates that Canada can negotiate outcomes that serve Canadian interests even when those outcomes may complicate US strategic objectives. That is agency. That is sovereignty in practice. The second major element involves electric vehicles and the broader question of industrial policy. In 2024, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. This decision was not driven by Canadian industrial concerns. Chinese EV manufacturers pose no immediate threat to Canadian production because Canada produces very few EVs domestically. The tariffs were imposed to align with US policy, which seeks to exclude Chinese manufacturers from North American markets entirely. But here is the strategic problem with that alignment. Canadian consumers are now paying significantly higher prices for electric vehicles. Competition has been artificially restricted. Canadian adoption of EVs, which government policy is supposed to encourage, has been slowed by a lack of affordable options. And despite all this sacrifice to please Washington, Canada still faces US tariffs on multiple sectors. The alignment delivered costs without benefits. If Canada reconsiders those EV tariffs during or after this China visit, the consequences become interesting. Chinese EVs would enter the Canadian market, prices would drop, competition would increase, Canadian consumers would benefit, but the real impact would be felt in Washington. Chinese EVs sitting in Canadian showrooms, available for purchase by Canadians traveling across the border or through gray market channels, would undermine the entire US strategy of market exclusion. Canada would not need to confront US policy directly. It would simply make that policy irrelevant in practice. This brings us to the broader strategic logic. Prime Minister Carney is not approaching China as an alternative to the United States. He is approaching China as one element in a diversified portfolio of economic relationships. Europe provides another element through the SAFE initiative and expanded trade agreements. The Middle East provides another through energy partnerships with Qatar and other Gulf states. Japan, South Korea, and other Asian democracies provide yet another layer. Each relationship reduces dependence on any single partner. The genius of this approach is that it operates through incentives rather than confrontation. When Canada has multiple major markets open to it, pressure from any single direction loses effectiveness. US tariffs on Canadian exports become less damaging when alternative markets exist. Threats carry less weight when Canada can redirect trade flows. Coercion becomes harder when the target has options. More importantly, this diversification changes the calculation for the United States itself. Every aggressive action toward Canada now carries the risk of pushing Canadian trade toward competitors. A tariff on Canadian autos strengthens the case for deepening ties with Asian manufacturers. Pressure on agriculture accelerates Canadian efforts to open alternative markets. Threats of annexation drive Canada toward partnerships that reduce US influence. In other words, the harder President Trump pushes, the more Canada has incentive to diversify and the less leverage the United States retains. This is why the visit matters beyond the specific agreements that may or may not emerge. It demonstrates that Canada has reached a strategic inflection point. Canada is no longer reacting to US pressure. Canada is restructuring the entire framework within which that pressure operates. And once that framework changes, the relationship itself must change. Consider the credibility element. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. He was governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. He was governor of the Bank of England for 7 years. He chaired the Financial Stability Board. When he walks into a room in Beijing or Davos or any other global capital, he's recognized immediately as someone who understands how markets function, how central banks operate, how international finance works. That credibility gives weight to Canada's positions in ways that political rhetoric never could. China understands this. President Xi and Premier Li are meeting with Carney not as a favor, but because Canada, under Carney's leadership, represents a serious economic opportunity and a potential partner in a world where US policy has become erratic. This is soft power deployed strategically. Canada is not the largest economy, not the most powerful military, but it is a stable, resource-rich, technologically advanced democracy with a leader who speaks the language of global finance. That combination has value, and Carney is leveraging it. The inevitable objection from critics of this China strategy runs as follows. Canada is naive. China is an authoritarian state with a terrible human rights record. Partnering with Beijing alienates Washington, undermines Western solidarity, and trades one dependence for another. Canada should stand with its democratic allies, even if that means absorbing economic pain. Let us address each component of this argument seriously. First, no one in the Carney government is under any illusion about the nature of the Chinese political system. Canada has been explicit in criticizing human rights abuses, supporting Hong Kong democracy activists, and raising concerns about Xinjiang. Those positions have not changed, but trade policy is not a moral endorsement. Canada trades with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with dozens of countries whose political systems do not reflect Canadian values. Trade is a tool for advancing Canadian interests, not a statement of approval for foreign governments. Second, the argument that this alienates Washington assumes Washington cares about Canadian loyalty. The evidence suggests otherwise. Despite decades of close alignment, despite fighting alongside the United States in Afghanistan, despite integrated supply chains and defense cooperation, Canada has been rewarded with tariffs, threats, and discussions of annexation. At what point does loyalty become self-harm? At what point does alignment cease to serve Canadian interests? Third, the concern about trading one dependence for another misunderstands the strategy entirely. Canada is not replacing US dependence with Chinese dependence. Canada is building a diversified network of trading relationships so that dependence on any single partner becomes impossible. China is one element. Europe is another. The Middle East is another. Asia-Pacific democracies are another. The goal is not to favor China. The goal is to ensure no single country can apply decisive pressure. Here is the cruel irony. The argument that Canada should absorb economic pain to maintain Western solidarity comes at the exact moment when the United States, the supposed leader of that solidarity, is threatening NATO allies, discussing territorial conquest, and treating trade as a weapon against friends. If this is Western solidarity, then solidarity has become a one-way obligation that serves only US interests. Canada is not abandoning the West. Canada is defending the principle that sovereignty matters, that alliances should be reciprocal, and that economic security requires options. If that principle is controversial, the problem is not with Canada's strategy. The problem is with an international system where loyalty has become synonymous with subservience. Distinguished viewers, what we are witnessing is not a pivot away from the West, but a return to an older Canadian tradition. The tradition of Lester Pearson, who understood that middle powers survive by building bridges, not by choosing rigid camps. The tradition of Pierre Trudeau, who insisted Canada would chart its own course even when that meant disagreeing with larger powers. The tradition of a country that has always understood that sovereignty requires options. Mark Carney's visit to China from January 13th to 17th is not the end of this strategy. It is the beginning. After Beijing, he travels to Davos to meet with global business leaders and investors. After Davos, he will continue building partnerships in Europe, the Middle East, and across the Asia-Pacific region. Each visit, each agreement, each new trading relationship reduces Canada's vulnerability and increases Canada's agency. The United States will remain Canada's largest trading partner for the foreseeable future. Geography, history, and deep economic integration ensure that. But largest does not mean only. And integration does not require subordination. President Trump has forced Canada to evolve. His tariffs, his threats, his casual discussions of annexation have made clear that dependence is dangerous. Prime Minister Carney has responded not with anger, but with strategy. He is building the economic architecture that will protect Canada for decades to come. This is Canada reclaiming sovereignty, not through rhetoric, but through structure. Not through confrontation, but through diversification. Not by rejecting partnerships, but by multiplying them. This is Canadian statecraft, and it begins in Beijing. Thank you for watching.